Hello and welcome everyone. My name is Mike Crook. I am the Director of User Experience here at Metrics. I want to thank you all for joining today. I want to hand it over to our Chief Marketing Officer, Marcus Graham, who will take us through today's webinar. Marcus, take it away. Thank you.
Hey, thanks a lot, Mike. Thanks for the introduction. And wow, got a lot of people coming into this program. We are thrilled to have you with us today. My name is Marcus Grimm. I'm the Chief Marketing Officer for the team here at Metrics, and we have a great program planned for you today. We've got Navigating the Shift, Implementing Competency-Based Learning in Healthcare Education. Let's take a look at the agenda slide here. We've got a lot of great things to go over today. So we're going to be talking about the evolution of competency-based medical education. It didn't used to be this way. Now we're talking about competency-based education all the time. Tosh will be taking us through some of that CBE lexicon. We're going to talk to you about how that overlaps with what at Metrics we call the People Process Platform Framework, which you can use for any innovation or change that you're trying to do in your organization. Then we'll be talking about some nuts and bolts stuff about curriculum alignment, evaluations and assessment, and faculty development and student advice. And so it is a jam-packed program. Tosh, welcome to the show. Let's go to this first slide. I do want to talk about this evolution of medical education because, these days it seems like we always talk about competency-based learning, but Tosh, as you've shared with me and taught me, it wasn't always that way. So let's set the stage here. How did we get to the point of where we are today?
When it comes to competencies, it's always important to remember what it is. It's essentially a way to standardize education models, and to go back in time before there was any sort of standardization in medical education. You got to go before the Flexner Report. In 1910, Abraham Flexner, he was commissioned by the Carnegie Foundation to go across the United States and study every single medical school and put together a report on their qualities. Essentially, are they teaching students how to become a competent physician? How do they compare to each other? And it was a damning report. It said that there is essentially no standardization. Schools were pretty much doing whatever they wanted to, and this led to the closure of many medical schools and the development of more standardized education across medical schools. And initially, this was more of a time-based standardization. You go to 4 years of medical school, and I know that we have audience members from different healthcare specialties, veterinary education, nursing, and even some allied health professionals joining today. Today I'm looking at it from a medical school perspective, being a physician myself, but I'm sure every healthcare education department has some sort of history like this, where there was lack of standardization, and then there was effort put into creating standardization. So this time-based model was what medical schools started doing. 4 years of training, first 2 years is classroom-based, and then there is clinical rotations for another 2 years, and then you graduate. And this worked for many years, in 30, 40, 50 years, that was the model. And then the last 20 to 30 years, you started to see a movement towards competency-based education. This is where you start to care more about individual competencies for these graduating trainees, and not simply that they went through a training program and hope they have mastered everything. You're actually focusing on their specific specialty, and are they competent in what they're supposed to be competent in to practice medicine.
So when we talk about the fact that moving from time-based to competency-based, I think it's important that we sort of unpack that for the audience, right? Because it's not something that's just trendy. I think on our next slide, let's pull up our next slide. What was so wrong with time-based education? Walk us through why this even makes sense for the change to occur.
Yeah, every student is different, essentially. When you look at a student that is starting medical school, they all come from different backgrounds, they have different skills, and a uniform approach for all students does not work. So that's the biggest challenge. And then the second thing is advancement in those competencies doesn't always happen at the same pace. Some students may progress rapidly, some progress may be slower. It doesn't necessarily mean that anyone is going to be worse off as a physician. It just means that some people take longer, and it's about how do you make sure that every person that is graduating is able to practice medicine and not put anybody at risk. And then this time-based model doesn't allow for those differences in developing your skills.
Wonderful. So as we take a look at the next slide, competency-based learning can be, relatively complex, but you've done a great job, or I should say our designers did an incredible job of distilling this down on this slide. When we think about what is competency-based learning, how do we break it down?
We in healthcare started focusing on outcomes and competencies in the last 10, 20 years. That's where most of this momentum has come. But it actually originally was first coined in 1978 in this paper that was published as Competency-Based Curriculum Development in Medical Education. And it was published by the World Health Organization. And in it, they highlighted three main pillars. First is curriculum. You want to make sure that competency-based curriculum is created across all of your courses and rotations or whatever training model that you're providing to the students. So curriculum is the foundation of which competencies are based on. Then you want to make sure that curriculum is the students are being tracked and monitored to make sure each of those individual students are meeting and mastering those competencies based on the careers they want to pursue. So if you're going to be doing something for medical school physicians, you want to make sure that you're going to be competent physician. If you're in nursing school, you will be training towards being a nurse. So based on your future career, you're ensuring that each of those students are mastering those competencies. Then finally, they also recommended treating education departments as an experiment. You're continuously improving and iterating and always looking at what are the things that we can change to improve the outcomes for our students.
Absolutely. So as you mentioned, this let's be clear, this isn't groundbreaking new stuff, but what is groundbreaking is now medical education is really embracing it at a super rapid pace. So if we take a look at the next slide here, every one of these organizations is at different stages of implementation with competency-based learning. Just sort of walk us through where we are with these major bodies right now and where we're going.
Yeah, I picked out a few of these that we've worked with recently with Metrics and the organizations that we're working with. But this is happening across the world. Different entities are putting together competencies for various health professions. One of the ones that we worked with closely is milestones for ACGME. Metrics actually started in 2013 when the ACGME first rolled out their milestones. That was the reason that we started building out a platform that supports competency-based education. AAMC released their physician competency reference set also around the same time ACGME released the milestones. And this is meant to be competencies that a curriculum can be mapped to. The American Association of Colleges of Nursing, they have the essentials, which are meant to capture the competencies that nursing school graduates should be trained in. Then there's separate essentials for bachelor's, doctorate, and master's level nursing. And one of the more recent development is the AAVMC has put out the CBVE milestones and EPAs for veterinary training. So this trend is rapidly accelerating in different areas of healthcare. And it all goes back to making sure that when a learner is graduating and practicing independently, you have data to back up that they're competent in what they should be doing. And one of the things that I have at the bottom is coming soon, foundational competencies for undergraduate medical education. This is a collaborative project between the ACGME, AAMC, and the ACOM, and they're going to be releasing the foundational competencies for medical schools soon. And it's been a multi-year project, and this is something that's been they put out like a version for public feedback, and the final version should be coming out soon. So it's happening everywhere.
And it seems to me that if we think about that, once that happens, there really won't be many, if any, large academic bodies that are not embracing competency-based learning. Now, when we talk about, a few slides ago, you went into the limitations of time-based education. So that tells us why we're heading in this direction. But I am curious, and it's on your next slide. Why now? As you point out, 46 years ago, we sort of defined what competency-based learning is. So let's, why now? I love to ask the question why, but then I like to ask the question why now? What's going on?
The biggest reason is public accountability, especially in the United States, started to shift towards an outcome-based healthcare model, where health insurance companies and governments are starting to ask, what is the actual impact of this work you're doing for patients? And because healthcare is moving to an outcome-based model, education is following that same path and asked to provide data to back up that training that they're providing. If you look at physician training in graduate medical education, the salaries of these physicians and the training programs are funded through taxpayer money through CMS reimbursements. To continue that funding, the government is also looking at data to make sure that these programs are graduating physicians that are able to practice medicine and take care of the public. That's one of the biggest reasons. And then the other, secondary reasons is because we can now. Before, it was difficult to capture all this data and analyze it in an efficient way. With the technology now, we can actually look at each student's performance and capture different evaluations and have that personalized approach to education. The final piece I would say is academic research has shown that this type of approach ends up being a better outcome for the learner. And when they graduate and become independent on their own, they're actually able to practice and have less negative impact on patients if they actually gone through a competency-based model than simply a time-based model.
That's really interesting. I really like the part about, that we actually can do it now. And we're going to be, the next part of this program here, we're going to be taking a look under the hood on how the metrics platform can help you do that and how organizations can prepare their data. But it's really well said that even if 46 years ago we said, okay, let's focus on those competencies. Well, how exactly do you do it? So let's go back to our agenda slide here. So that sort of takes us, I love going through those history lessons. And folks, I got to tell you, Tosh and I left about 10 slides on the cutting room floor that really dug into that history, because it really is fascinating to know how we got to this point. So if you understand that background and how we ended up here, so what exactly is the lexicon? What are the buzzwords that we need to know? What's the language that we need to know? How do we actually do this at the organizational level? Tosh, we've got a few slides about this. I did this first one. Let's bring it up here. I'd call it some of our key vocab if we're going to get into the business of competency-based learning.
Yep, absolutely. So when it comes to, I think most people on this call may have already been familiar with the idea of competencies, sub-competencies. Just take a look at it. A competency is essentially going to be a more broad statement that is the high level category. And in physician training, there's 6 core competencies, patient care, medical knowledge, and so on. So let's say we look at the category of patient care. That's the core competency. These organizations typically do is they break that down into sub-competencies, which is more granular and specific components. So in patient care, you may have something like history taking and physical exam, where that's going to be a sub-competency. And then inside of that sub-competency, you will have specific observable milestones that the students or residents may meet as part of their training or their academic journey. So that's really the 3 levels of that hierarchy: competency, sub-competency, and milestones. And then entrustable professional activities, or EPAs, are essentially specific tasks or responsibilities that a healthcare professional has to do. And often this will cover one or more competencies or sub-competencies. So let's take a look at that with an example. So this is an example from the ACGME and how they have organized the milestones for residency and fellowship programs. So at the highest level, you have the competency. So this is the patient care competency. And then you have the sub-competency, which is urgent and emergent medical conditions. So this is the 5th sub-competency of patient care. That's why it's called patient care 5. And then you can see it's broken down into milestones underneath it, and they have levels 1 through 5 for these milestones. Level 1 is essentially what a learner is expected to be at when they start training, when they're in their first year of residency. And then each resident will progress through these levels at varying speed, essentially. Like, at the end of the first year, you may have one resident that is a level 3 in professionalism, another one that is at a level 2. That's okay. It's they're allowed to progress at different pace. But when they graduate, they should be at level 4 or 5. Level 5 is considered an aspirational. Some may achieve it, some may not. But ideally, everyone should be at 4, some at 5 to be ready for independent practice.
Very well said. And how I think your next slide is your EPA. How does that factor into this?
Yep. This is from the AAVMC. I really love how they've organized these EPAs. So I wanted to show an example because we often get questions from our clients, especially on the medical school and residency programs of how to create and structure EPAs. I think the AAVMC has done a wonderful job with providing this PDF that not only shows the EPAs, but how to map them. So here's an EPA, entrustable professional activity, develops a diagnostic plan and interprets results. So if you look at that, that is the professional activity that a veterinarian should be able to do. And then underneath that, what they did was they have mapped it to their milestones. So if a faculty member is evaluating a student on this EPA, that's going to cover these milestones. These are the components of it. And then they put the milestone code here. So it's 1.2, 9.1. So these are the things that they are going to evaluate the student on. And then they mapped it to their competency milestones 1.1 and 9.1, which is in a separate PDF. With this tool, a faculty member can evaluate a student on a standardized EPA and make sure that that standardized EPA is also collecting information on a standardized set of competencies or milestones. And if multiple schools are doing the same type of evaluation, then you can compare how are different schools doing on these competency-based education and how on their performance. This is one of the things that I always talk to our clients about. You don't necessarily have to use these EPAs or other things that are provided by these organizations. As long as you use the competencies, you can make up these EPAs. The most important thing is mapping them to the same set of competencies so that you can compare data.
Right.
That's the key thing here.
And it also seems to me, and as I look at this EPA here, and even when we were looking at your previous slide, as you mentioned, like we're getting totally away from time-based things. Nobody's saying you should be here in 1 semester or 2 semesters, but these are the competencies we're trying to actually prove. And our next slide here, that's where you're kind of focusing on, hey, listen, we're no longer looking at a learner. We're not looking at a calendar anymore. We're actually looking at that learner, right?
Exactly. So this is a diagram that essentially shows what happens if you implement a competency-based education model. This is a feedback mechanism. So you initially start with the curriculum that is something that is aligned to the competencies, and then you track the progress of students as they go through their training, and then you provide feedback. The feedback can be to the individuals and to the organization, and you continuously improve the curriculum, continuously improve the feedback, the feedback that you're collecting. And that's what that WHO study from 1978 was talking about. It essentially becomes an experiment that you're running to improve your training methods. And then as the years go by, the learners that are graduating, they become more and more aligned with the competencies. And you can also adjust the competencies because as time goes on, the things that they need to learn is also evolving. For example, these days, one could argue that artificial intelligence is probably a competency that physicians should be learning about in their medical education.
Excellent. Excellent. So if we take a look then at our slides, that you've taken us now through both the history and the lexicon, the words we need to know. And it's interesting to me that when we think about competency-based learning, it's big, right? It goes all the way across the organization. And oftentimes at Metrics, we talk about people process and platform. And people process platforms is one of those things that really just dovetails well with competency-based learning. Let's pull up that next slide, Tosh, and sort of, one of the things that I know when you work with your clients and your teams, yes, that metrics platform is a piece of that puzzle, but it's not the only piece. So talk about how all three of these come together for competency-based learning.
And even before that, you can see here, we always put platform as the last thing. It's people, process, and platform, and it's in that order for a specific reason. When you're trying to implement something, especially at a large organization, the first thing that you have to do is bring in the right people into the room and make sure that you are getting input and getting them involved with that change. So identifying the key people. Here we are talking about it from an onboarding perspective for metrics, but you can take this approach for every single type of project that you're going to do within your organization. Identify key people that have their hands on that day-to-day operations, and put together a committee. Second thing is looking at their existing processes, mapping them out. And then once you have those processes mapped out, second phase of that is how do you create new processes to go through that transformation? And then once you have the people and the processes figured out, that's when technology is going to be helpful. If you jump straight into the technology without doing the first two parts, then you're often going to end up with a implementation that nobody wants to use. So this is something that is key for how we onboard metrics. We always want to put together a committee, map out the processes, go through all that detail, and then implement the technology. And we're going to use this framework to talk about how competency-based education can be implemented at organizations.
Outstanding. So if we take, and I love that you spoke very much about the order here. If we take a look at our next slide, I almost kind of think of that what you just said, Tosh, is it's a little bit of a disclaimer for what's going to come next, because we're going to take a look under the hood here. We're going to see how well the metrics platform supports competency-based learning. That being said, you're going to want to have those people and processes buttoned up ahead of time. Look, we can't help the people on your team, but we have a lot of confidence that you have the right people on your team. I know the metrics team can work with you also to improve those processes and tighten up those processes. But once all that's done, we get under the hood. Let's take a look at how you can actually do that inside the platform. So we're going to be taking a look at curriculum alignment first. Take it away, Tosh.
So if we look at curriculum, which I said earlier that this is the foundation of that competency-based model, because curriculum is what determines the instructions that you're providing to the students. You can only collect feedback after you actually taught them something. The first part of this is making sure that your curriculum is aligned with any sort of competencies that you want to implement. If you haven't been using a competency framework until now, the first step is putting together a committee that can help realign your curriculum to that new framework. And this committee doesn't have to be every single faculty member. It's individuals that are going to be leading that project. Definitely should include the curriculum dean, key faculty members, especially individuals that are passionate about this and they can drive change within the organization, and coordinators that are involved with the curriculum and especially the curriculum content. And one of the things that I always recommend is putting a committee that includes preclinical and clinical team members. Because a lot of times, especially in the medical school world, we see that curriculum is often led by the preclinical teams, because that's where you have more curricular content being developed, because you have lectures, labs, small group sessions. But remember that clinical side also has a curriculum of what's being taught in the clerkships. So it's important to ensure that your committee includes clinical representation. Once we have that team together, it's essentially making sure that there is clear project management happening, because sometimes you start with the idea of changing the curriculum and it lasts forever because there is no clear measurable goals, deadlines, and most importantly, delegating one person as a project lead for this curriculum alignment project. Without that lead, everybody is if you put everybody in charge of something, then no one's in charge. Having one project lead, measurable goals, deadlines, and then regular check-ins to make sure that this transformation or this editing and changing is happening. And then once you have the people and the processes for realigning the curriculum in place, then you can use a tool like Metrics or some other software curriculum mapping tool. And these days, AI to help align that curriculum with the new competencies that you have selected.
Right.
And this requires top-level leadership support and allocation of resources to make sure this happens.
Yeah, it's a really good point. Earlier, we took a look at those EPAs, and it's really nice to look at those EPAs, and they're color coded, so that's really attractive. But at the end of the day, somebody's got to map those objectives, right? So on the next slide, you sort of walk through like, okay, well, for you to end up with that nice color coding and the schematics of everything, there's going to be some work involved. So you're going to show us now exactly what that looks like if you're doing it manually, and then you're also going to walk us through inside how it looks inside the metrics platform. So show us how that looks.
Yep. So this is a hierarchy that is often used in the medical school world, and we've also seen this happening in other healthcare professions, where at the top level you have some national or international competency or standard, and then the school would create their own objectives of what they're going to be teaching the students. So this is AAMC's Physician Competency Reference Set. Down here, we have institutional level objectives, which is going to be mapped to the PCRS. Then for the preclinical side, every course, biochemistry, anatomy, they all have objectives. Within each course, you may have multiple lectures, labs, small group sessions, each with their own objectives. So those session objectives are going to be mapped to course objectives. Course objectives are mapped to the institutional objectives. Institutional objectives are mapped to their the PCRS. So you can see how this hierarchy allows you to align your entire preclinical content to the national standard that is provided through the AAMC. But it doesn't have to be the AAMC's PCRS. It could be any framework. You know, if you're using it for nursing, it could be the essentials here. And then you're going to align the school's curriculum to that. Now, on the right side, we have institutional objectives, and then there's the rotation objectives. Rotations typically do not have separate sessions underneath it, so that's why we're stopping at the overall rotation objectives. You're simply going to have rotations being delivered at different hospitals or clinics, but they have their own objectives without separate lectures and labs that you're tracking objectives for.
When you talk about that objective mapping, it's interesting to me. You know, one of the things that you've mentioned is Metrics. Fortunately, was kind of at the front edge of this because ACGME was first to get into competency-based learning. But what I hear you saying is, if I'm undergraduate and I use the Metrics platform, it's not like I fire it up and it's pre-configured for ACGME. You could bring in whatever standards you wanted to, correct?
Yeah, that's a great question. Essentially, Metrics was built in a way that we wanted to support any type of competency-based model. And physicians that are using, or the physician training programs, if they're in undergraduate medical education, like medical schools, they often would align to the AAMC's PCRS. There are some international schools that we work with that are also aligning with CanMeds, which was created by the Canadian, the Royal College. And there's also the nursing, the AAC and Essentials. So the system is built in a way that we can load any competency framework and align it with that school's objectives. We provide the technology. Often the schools will tell us what information they want loaded with this mapping.
Perfect. So let's take a look under the hood here. I know you got a window pulled up. Show us what it looks like.
Yeah. So what I wanted to show here is I'm not going to go into the full demonstration of curriculum. One of the things that I want to highlight here is what the results look like once you have it mapped. The reason that you want to use a tool like Metrics or any other tool that supports transparency across the organization is because you don't want to simply have a curriculum that's built and just sitting in some folder somewhere on a spreadsheet. This curriculum should be accessible and searchable and readily available to anyone in the medical school, nursing school, or veterinary school. So here, if I go to the curriculum search, I can see right away that I have 2 academic years worth of curriculum in the system. I'm going to go back to 2023 to 2023 to 2024, and I can search for something in here. If I just click search, it's going to bring me all of the course objectives. I can my biochemistry and molecular medicine course up here. I want to click on it. I can see more details about this course, including all the different sessions that are part of it. More importantly, once I get down here, I can click one of these objectives and see how it connects to the curriculum. So this is the course objective. This is connected to one of the session objectives for a particular lecture. And above it is the institutional objective, which is aligned with a national objective. So in this example, this is a CBBE objective from a veterinary school. Same thing here. You can have more mappings. So everyone that has access to this search in the organization, every faculty member, students, has access to the curriculum and see how it's all connected together. This is also powerful when you have a site visitor or someone that is coming to your organization and asking you, how do you map your curriculum and make it available? Simply pull up metrics, go to this page, and show them how it's done. Couple of things that I'm not going to go into today is, this mapping is one of the tedious processes that a lot of schools have to do. We have also incorporated a way to do this using AI so that you get a recommended mappings using AI, and then you can simply review and approve it.
And it would seem to me that one of the things when we talk about the value proposition of metrics, I know what you always talk about is save time. And it seems to me that mapping all those objectives, that's a lot of manual labor. And I know that was the reason that your team decided, let's deploy AI here for curriculum mapping. But there were a couple other reasons that you felt that AI was a perfect use case for metrics. And before we go on to the next slide, just sort of walk us through why this is a good use for AI when some other things might not be.
Yep. One of the things that we decided when we started integrating AI into metrics is we wanted to make sure that we're not simply throwing stuff in there for the sake of having AI, because ultimately the platform and the centralized access is the value that we provide. But we wanted to use AI to target tedious problems that organizations face. And this is definitely one of the tedious problems they have, aligning these objectives. And often faculty members are not trained on curriculum mapping, and it's nobody wants to read 2 sentences and see how they fit together. Well, it's not 2, it's thousands of sentences and try to see how they all fit together. It's also something that we found it was appropriate for AI. The biggest advances in AI is the large language models, which is mainly for text analysis and generating text. So that's why we thought that this was appropriate for that. And the final piece so the first is tedious problems. Second is making sure that it is appropriate for that AI, for an AI to solve. And the third is making sure it's done in a way that there's always a human that is accepting the changes. Every time a AI tool is added to metrics, it's always going to be a human in the loop approach where it's going to show you a recommendation and a faculty member or dean will be able to accept it and save the changes.
Great. So that takes us through step 1, which is we need to actually map that curriculum. So if we go back to our slides and our agenda here, so that walks us through the curriculum alignment. Let's talk about evaluations and assessments next.
You built out the curriculum, you mapped it, and then your faculty members started teaching these topics in their lectures and labs. Now we come into the second part of it. How do we make sure we're having the impact that we thought we were going to have? This is where your evaluations and assessments is going to give you insight into what did the students take away from these lectures or rotations or whatever activities that they went to. And to do that, you have to look at your entire assessment and evaluation model. And it's important to look at it holistically across all years of training, not only the preclinical or not only the clinical. And that's why on this first step here, I again emphasize that when you try to do competency-based education management, create a committee that it represents both basic sciences and clinical faculty. Competencies develop over time, and it shouldn't be siloed into preclinical and clinical. So this includes deans, course, and clinical faculty members. And then looking at feedback, how do you make sure that you're collecting this feedback longitudinally over time, and you can compare the preclinical data to the clinical data? That's where you create questions for your exams and quizzes that map to the same competencies that the clinical staff, the clinical teams are using. You can see how the students are progressing from the earlier levels into the advanced levels as they progress through their clinical years. The last thing, when it comes to technology, we often come into organizations that are using different products for clinical and then that they're using for preclinical. It's very difficult to track competencies if you're doing that, because if you have evaluations and data being collected for preclinical in one platform and it's not being centralized in the same platform that the clinical team is using, how are you going to be able to compare from one year to the next? It's key to look at your technology and make sure that all data is flowing into one place.
Yeah, absolutely. Because the realities are you're either not going to compare the data or you've just created a lot of manual work for somebody. What does it, let's keep going on this concept on terms of, how we actually do this for evaluations.
Yep. And I want to do that by diving a little bit into the clinical side, because that's where we often get this feedback through evaluations. In the preclinical world, it's often through exams and assessments, midterms, final quizzes. In the clinical world, it's when you get feedback from faculty members. And it's often a more challenging area for schools because clinical faculty members, their primary responsibility is patient care. They go to the hospital, they want to make sure, I'm a clinical faculty myself, I do emergency radiology. I go to the hospital, my number one thing is I'm getting a patient's CT scan that has been in a car accident. I'm not thinking about evaluations. I'm thinking about making sure that I diagnose what I need to diagnose on that study, which means that these forms are often the last thing that a clinical faculty is looking at when they're done with their day. So to make that a priority for them, this is what I recommend. Make this more tailored to their specialty. Focus on clinical relevance. Create criteria that's aligned with their specialty, so that it's not some academic jargon that's pulled on the form that they don't really have time to read. Make it relevant to their clinical specialty. Work with clerkship directors or faculty members to create forms that are tailored to that specialty, but each of those questions are mapped back to that standardized set of competencies. So you're getting what you need to compare competencies of students, but the faculty members are getting something that is more personalized to their specialty. So ask a cardiologist about questions related to cardiology, and those questions are mapped back to the same competencies that all other faculty members are answering. So transparent communication, making sure that you're providing feedback to the faculty members, and also making sure you're using some sort of technology to deliver these forms. Continuous feedback from 360 degrees. And this is very important. When you're shifting towards a competency-based model, it's not only about collecting feedback from one person. You want to collect feedback from multiple sources to make sure that all stakeholders agree that the student has met those competencies they need to meet. So this often becomes peer feedback, faculty to student feedback, resident evaluating students, or if you're in the residency world, peer feedback, faculty feedback, nursing feedback. So look at who else is interacting with this learner and see if there's a way that you can deliver a form to them.
So walk us through then. So that's exactly what we're trying to do here. And I love how these next few slides that you have set up kind of take us through, how that actually looks like in the real world.
So I'm going to use this as an example. This is actually a screenshot of the ACGME's milestones for radiology, which is my specialty. So if you look at this, and if you give this to a radiology faculty member, you can see it is very generic and academic. Image interpretation. Level 1 identifies primary image finding. Level 2 identifies secondary and critical image findings. If you give this to every single radiologist, what often happens is they circle one of these, usually level 3, and they move on. But if you create something that incorporates their specialty into it, for example, for me, if you're asking me about critical findings or in emergency situations, because I do emergency radiology, then I'm going to care more about this question than what this generic question is. It looks like it was created for me.
Right.
But behind the scenes, this question is going to be mapped to a standardized milestone that the school needs to report on, or the organization needs to report on to ACGME. And the cool thing is, with AI, we can do some of this faster. Before, if we needed to write something like this, you had to do it from scratch and by yourself. But with tools, AI tools now, you can get help in crafting these questions and also mapping them to the appropriate milestones or competencies. So here's a couple of examples where I put together, in the preclinical world, you may have exams and quizzes, and they have questions that is created on those exams. How do you map those to those competencies? This is something, whichever software you're using, you can take those questions and say, this is going to be aligned with these milestones or competencies. And I'm using those words interchangeably because depending on the school, depending on the organizations, they may call it, one may call it milestones, one other may call it competencies. And then for the clinical world, you have clinical evaluation questions, and you have those mapped to the same competencies. The preclinical and the clinical are now aligned, and you're collecting data. And then over time, you can see how students have progressed in those competencies and how they're developing more and more skills as they go through their years of training.
And so you've got it really, really well mapped to those competencies. So that's how it would look outside of metrics. So let's take a look then. Let's go back under the hood and show me what that looks like inside metrics.
Yep. So one of the things that we often help schools do is move their evaluation forms into metrics. So I'm going to go into the metrics evaluation page here. So let's say we have a competency-based evaluation for a resident here. I want to edit this form. There's a lot of settings here I'm going to skip over, and I'm going to get to the second page where I can build questions. So here I have one question that I've already created called evaluate the trainee's professionalism. I'm going to edit that question. One of the things that metrics allow you to do is take a question and map it to different competencies or sub-competencies. So you can see here I picked a couple of random ones, and this one question is going to be mapped to these 3 sub-competencies. Obviously, this question is about professionalism, but I'm mapping it to patient care and medical knowledge, which in the real world probably doesn't make any sense. But the key thing is you're able to pick which sub-competencies this question aligns with and get data about those sub-competencies without giving faculty members all this academic jargon. Faculty members will see a simple question that they're going to want to answer, but behind the scenes, you're getting the competency data that you need.
Tosh, we've talked about this. You being your role, you also fill out these forms for residents, and you've talked about this, right? You need to make it as simple and as fast as possible. At a certain level, you are your customer, right? So when you add that jargon, like it's hard enough to get these things filled out, right?
Exactly. It's not only physicians, anyone. Like nobody wants to read these complex academic jargon, especially when they're in a hospital setting and they're worried about their patients and getting through their work. You want to keep it simple and easy for them to read and understand. But from an educational department or dean's perspective, you do care about it because that's what you need to look at to compare performance across different trainees and even report that if you need to report it. So it's giving essentially it's usability for the faculty with data for the administration.
Outstanding. So yeah, at the end of the day, and here's what I really love about this is we map the competencies because we want to make sure we're measuring the students. We're getting the evaluations, and those evaluations are mapped to competencies. So guess what? Now we know we've got a lot more rich data on what we know about our students. So now that takes us full circle to if I'm actually going to advise this student, I now have better data to work with, right?
Exactly. So the trend that we're seeing in different schools is that they're putting together mentors or advisory groups. And medical schools, for example, are creating these advisory groups that are paired with students. So let's say 5 or 6 students are paired with the same mentor, and they're working with them throughout their entire academic journey. So they're going to be meeting with them every few months, every few weeks, depending on their schedule. And these mentors are looking at the competencies and creating feedback or putting together feedback for that student on how to improve. So that the people aspect of this is the mentors and advisors, whether they're recruited internally or externally, it depends on your organization. Second is the process development for structured feedback. You can't simply say, hey, meet with this person and get some feedback. You want to develop a formal process of when do they meet, what are they expected to talk to the students about, and give that to those mentors and advisors. And then finally, the technology. How do you get these mentors the data that they need to provide the feedback? And that's where a tool like Metrics can help, and you can give them real-time snapshots into the students' competencies so that they can quickly give them the feedback they need.
Yeah, and I love, you're going to take us under the hood here for a minute as you pull up the competency dashboard, which I think is just who doesn't love good looking graphs, right? But I do want to make a point here, which is, when you talk about the difference between a centralized platform and several decentralized platforms, getting this holistic view of a student only happens if all the data is in a central place. So I definitely think that that's important to say, right, Tosh? Because if you don't have all that data in that central repository, it's really tough to get that holistic view of the student performance. Correct?
Yeah, exactly. And it doesn't always mean that you have to collect this in the same system. It's about making sure it ends up in the same system. So for example, we often talk to schools and they use different software platforms. For example, ExamSoft is one of the popular tools that schools use for midterms and finals. And that's not something that Metrics is currently providing to schools. But schools can take the data from an exams administration tool like ExamSoft and import the competency data into Metrics so you can look at it in one central location. So it's all about looking at the competency data in one place, but you may collect some of this information in different tools based on what your operations look like. And
phenomenal.
This is a snapshot of what that looks like. If you're giving a mentor access to this competency reporting, there's a few different ways to look at this data. I pulled up the competency graphs because it gives them a snapshot. You can select a learner, select this is a resident, and you select a date range. And I'm looking at all of the forms that I have in the system and those answered during this date range, and come down and see the overall competency, overall sub-competency for each of them. And then if you have peer data, you can also compare that here. Peer in this instance is other learners that are in the same academic level. So a mentor can look at this, discuss this with the student, and develop a plan for the next few months and see how that student progresses in their competency development.
Outstanding. So let's go full circle on this now, and take us back to how you think about assuming a program or a school wants to make this move to competency-based education. What does it look like to work with Metrics to bring together the people, process, and platforms into one place?
The most important thing is commitment to this, in terms of you as an organization says, this is what we're going to move towards, a competency-based model. And then it's a matter of breaking it up into different projects, and for each project, putting together the right committee together, then looking at that committee and what processes they're involved with, and then implementing the technology. It's not an overnight change. It happens in phases. Typically, even if you want to do this across preclinical and clinical, you have to do that as separate projects because you don't want to change all these things at once. So you may do the preclinical first and then the clinical. But the idea is each of these projects have specific individuals that are all working towards that common goal. And then there is that top level leadership to guide this to that overall outcome. Because if each department is doing their own thing, it's very hard to find that alignment and see that data across the full academic journey for that student or a student.
So if let's go to our last slide here, and I'll tell the audience this is our final slide. So this is also going to be the Q&A section. I've got a couple questions for Tosh, but you can see up there different ways Metrics helps, and I know, Tosh, that you and your team very often this is sort of where you start. Like, let's figure out what challenges you're working on. Is it preclinical? Is it clinical? So just want to talk very briefly about those three buckets of audiences that you serve.
When it comes to metrics, we're often speaking to individuals on one of these three areas first. So it could be preclinical, and they often approach us with the curriculum being the area that they want to start, but they also want to make sure that there is evaluations for the preclinical they want to standardize. But once we get into that conversation, it becomes, what is the long-term goal? Are you trying to align the organization into a common set of competencies or outcomes that you want to monitor? Then the student is going through 4 years of training, or if you're in a nursing program, it may be 2 years. It could be depending on the length of the program. But ultimately, there's a preclinical component, there's a clinical component, and it's best to plan it out so that long term you're collecting information that is standardized and comparable, so you can see that student progress through their competencies, and they graduate and they're able to practice independently, and you have data to back it up.
Very, very well said. Question for you, Tosh, and I would definitely encourage as we get to we've only got a few minutes left here, but a question that I have for you is, we started this by talking about the, competency-based education is definitely, that is the trend. That's what we're hearing about. And I'm curious, obviously Metrics has a lot of graduate medical clients. So of course, they're already there. But if you think about your entire customer base now, Tosh, the undergraduate as well, and veterinary, how serious, what percentage of those customers do you feel are in the process of making this trend, or at least researching this trend? Is it here to stay?
Yeah, it is here to stay. And I would say about 25% of them have some sort of competencies implemented and are actually collecting competency data. At least another 40% are in the phase of determining how to do it. And it's a lot of internal process mapping they have to do, of rolling out a new curriculum or aligning with a standard. And then the rest are either in the earlier phase of implementation, or of some part of the system. So I would say more than half is at some phase of adopting competency-based model. And the reason that is happening is because it hasn't really been a requirement. As I mentioned earlier, the ACOM, ACGME, and AAMC is getting ready to release that foundational competencies for medical schools. I believe there's going to be a big momentum, a big shift happening when that is officially released. For the veterinary community, the AAVMC has released the CBBE milestones and EPA. So we're seeing more and more vet schools starting to adopt those. So it's kind of happening more because these organizations are putting these documents out there and saying, this is what we recommend.
Excellent. So the trend is real. The trend is here, and obviously, Tosh, you and the Metrics team would be happy to help. Mike, I think we've got a poll question here, and we're heading into the last minute of this thing. Let's fire up that poll question. There's a question for you. We would love for you all to please take this poll question. Scale of 1 to 10. How are we doing? Do me a favor, folks. Don't give us a 7. We can't learn from a 7. If you loved what we did today, let's go 8 to 10. And if you don't, hey, that's okay too. That's how we learn. That's how we get better. And obviously an opportunity to learn from the Metrics team. Tosh, this has been a fun one. I want to thank you for all the information you gave to us today. Tosh and the team are available to talk about any of your needs for the Metrics platform. Feel free to go to metricslab.com or shoot the guy a message. He's fresh off a vacation. He'd love to talk to anyone. Tosh, anything else we need to add before I take it out here?
No, this is a topic that I'm very passionate about. Feel free to message me. I'm on LinkedIn. My first name at Metrics Lab is my email.
Wonderful, wonderful. Well, hey, thanks so much for joining us. We do believe on keeping these things on time. And oh my goodness, there is the top of the hour. So we're going to let you all go with the rest of your day. For everyone on the Metrics team, I'm Marcus Grimm. Thank you so much for joining us today. Have a wonderful rest of your week.